Hello and welcome to another edition of On Air. That's the online format of the Swiss AI Weeks that happened in whole September and Wildcard Media. Today, we have a super exciting, high-profile panel with the topic QUO VADIS Frontier AI, Speed, Sovereignty, and Scale, where Andrei Villarroel will host the podium with John Horton, Abhi Ingle, and Bogy Skowronski. These will be the next 60 minutes. You have the chance to ask questions in the chat. Please use that function. And with that, I already hand over to Andrei.
Thank you and good evening. This is a great opportunity we have today to be thinking about the future of society, the future of where AI can take us, and with a great set of panelists. Let me start with one number, 10 gigawatts. 10 gigawatts is that one AI supercomputer that OpenAI announced just last month. That's 10 billion watts of continuous computation capacity. For context, assuming we have the same technology, Switzerland Alps supercomputer uses 0.01 gigawatts compared to the OpenAI supercomputer I just mentioned, 10 gigawatts. OpenAI could compute in 1 year what would take Switzerland Alps 1,000 years. And the United Arab Emirates is building yet another AI site with 5 gigawatts. Well, these numbers reveal something profound. We're at a frontier moment in human history. Actually, I would say at many frontiers. Beyond what the simple arithmetic of compute may say. Think of the Panama Canal for a moment. That monumental construction that took 20 years to build, thousands of workers from 100 countries, thousands of lives lost in the process. It created economic value that endures until today, which has reshaped the economies globally, logistics, what we trade, where we trade. Many nations work together to build infrastructure that connected everyone. And today, I believe we are in the same place, with AI opening up new frontiers. Compute capacity scaling 1,000 times from one achievement to the next announcement. Capital investments flowing at 100 billion per infrastructure project. Yet education is lagging to train billions of people into that new reality. Society is in great need to test public policies, regulation that could help us go in the right direction before the old policies and the old regulations break. Well, the question is not, can we keep up? I think the question today is if together we can build what AI cannot build for us, which is a brighter future. I've gathered 4 experts to help us navigate these frontiers. Abhi Ingle from SambaNova Systems, building this compute infrastructure, exploring that frontier, which may actually help us achieve the interoperability with other systems. Bogy Skowronski, a seasoned investor in technology, mapping the capital frontier. Are we making the right smart investments so that we can get shared prosperity? Professor John Horton from MIT Sloan, who leads the Generative AI Lab and is Anthropic's Economic Council member, who would help us look at society and the futures we may be able to build, test, thanks to AI, before we actually implement them. And myself, helping replace one of our friends here, looking at the education frontier, where hopefully we train for wisdom that outlives the huge transition that we're facing. Each of our panelists will speak for 4 minutes about their frontier topic. How do we ensure these frontiers expand opportunity? At every frontier, be it compute, investment, education, or society, we likely face trade-offs. And tonight, we're only looking at 3 of them. The speed at which we can implement the scale of intelligence that we can truly make benefit of, and sovereignty of control. Who shapes the direction of what we're building? Maybe traditional thinking will tell that we can't have all 3, but perhaps tonight we learn that we can. So with that, let's help that we build value among all things that most of us can share for greater purpose. Let's start with Abhi, please, if you may join us. Abhi?
Sorry, I had to be unmuted. So I wasn't able to unmute myself. Can you stop sharing, Andrei, so I can quickly share?
Go ahead.
Perfect. Thank you. I'm going to start off very quickly out here. Just a quick background. I'm the Chief Product Strategy and Engineering Officer at SambaNova Systems. Just quickly, we are a full stack AI chip and system startup. Key is we focus on inferencing. We are 2 to 5 times, 4 times the energy efficiency of GPUs, fully air cooled, and we produce inferencing at 3 to 5 times the speed of GPUs. We have a fairly illustrious board of people who founded us, including the chairman, the CEO of Intel is our chairman, and 3 luminaries from Stanford who did this. Quickly, I want to jump into the speed of issue of scale, right? We started off with this interesting perspective from Andrei on how much scale is being put into place. And the way I would think about it is I'm going to take a very Swiss perspective, saying, will countries like Switzerland have to do the same thing? The US and China are racing to build AI empires powered by quads of compute, trillions in investment, and vast fossil fueled energy supplies, right? And countries like Switzerland find themselves at crossroads. And my perspective is that in this particular scenario, if you look at that 17 gigawatt Stargate scenario, that's more than Portugal and Switzerland's energy consumption. It doesn't make sense to try to play the same game. To me, Switzerland should be Switzerland and perhaps take a different path on how you attack the problem. Maybe focus perhaps rather than building foundational models, which take hundreds of researchers, focus on the inference and the vertical applications, the application of AI. That's sort of my opening thesis. And I'll talk a little bit about how you kind of build this rapidly, right? Because the issue is not whether you should be sovereign or not, because in an era where AI defines economic power, security, and cultural influence, sovereignty is not just about borders, it's really about data, algorithms, and who controls them. And for a nation like Switzerland, fiercely independent, deeply democratic, and globally connected, it's not a luxury, it's a necessity. The question is, how should you approach it, right? So if you go there, our perspective is people talk about these massive data centers you need to build because essentially, if you look at the latest training chips, they require massive cooling, massive liquid cooling, and you have a very focused and differentiated data center capability for that. Our perspective is that it can be done differently. If you build for inference, if you use an alternate architecture to essentially supplement the dominant paradigm of a GPU, which was, by the way, engineered 30 years ago, you could actually have a container. That shipping container out there actually is 10 racks of compute right in there. It can be stood up very quickly, 3 to 4 months, and we can actually have a fully managed inference service running for somebody in just 4 months, right? If you kind of focus on open source models, you can actually own the governance on this particular area. And from a Swiss perspective, there's a lot that you can do to strengthen R&D, supplement with some foreign labor, democratize AI access, and take a core vertical process. So when I come down and close it out, sovereignty is core to what's the Swiss ethos. You have a historic perspective on neutrality, regulation, transparency. You're a trusted third party. If you take that same approach and trust to open source models and create an open ecosystem, democratizing open source model access to developers, and take a domain specific approach in areas that you already have domain strengths, finance, healthcare, engineering, I think that's something that can allow Switzerland to both play the game of scale appropriate to Switzerland, speed that is built modularly, focused on inferencing, and an approach which is rooted in its historic strengths. That's my thesis, Andrei.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Abhi, for sharing. Bogy, mind you stepping in with the investment perspective?
Yes, so thank you so much, Andrei, for the invitation, and great to be among all of you. My perspective is on the investment, and just as a quick background, I am an investor within a group called FounderPartners in Silicon Valley, and I have also started a tech accelerator in Europe called Start Smart CEE. We cooperate very closely with MIT in this aspect. Now, you probably all heard pretty amazing numbers that are flowing into both startups, larger firms, and all the big tech companies are investing billions and billions into building out their infrastructure. And the kind of federal government level, I think, EU has committed close to 200 billion, US well above that, China, of course, as well. And then individually, all the companies or the corporates are making huge investments. So it's really head-spinning numbers that are happening. And, I think we kind of can think of, okay, are these investments really justified? Maybe this is a hype, maybe this is a bubble. But let's remind ourselves that AI, when OpenAI first introduced ChatGPT, the adoption rate has been amazing, the fastest ever. So on one hand, we may think, okay, are we really ready for all of this? But let's realize that we are all extremely curious what this new technology is. And in the kind of basic use of using search, I think everybody tried it. Like, I cannot think of, that somebody has not tried it, right? So I think, on the base level, kind of recommendation engine and search, I think the adoption is huge. And I think 2 billion users by the end of next year that OpenAI is saying, will be using and paying for the app. Now, when it comes to the consequences of adoption, I think that's a very different subject. But thinking about the opportunities that this technology will bring to us, I'm extremely excited. As an investor, we are transitioning to really looking purely into startups, into technologies that are using AI. If you don't have AI today, I think it's not right. I mean, you have to come up with a solution, with a way of moving it and moving there. And it's also a question of not being rash, not working out of FOMO, not thinking because others have so much more, can we, being a smaller company on smaller nation, can we really catch up? And my answer here would be yes, I would be very optimistic what the future will hold, but we all have to be engaged and care how this future is going to look. Because, if we don't take care of certain things, of certain laws and regulations, maybe not too quickly, maybe allowing the technology to really take its speed and its development, we have to be wise about it. But I think the opportunities that it brings is amazing. I'm extremely optimistic. We just need to stay close to the beat of it to make sure that we all benefit from it as a human race.
Thank you so much, Bogy. And here, let me step in the shoes of one of the big initiatives that have motivated me to think beyond the pure infrastructure, which was the MIT Universal AI Summit, which took place just last summer, where the mission was simple. Let's upskill 1 billion people into AI. As a parent that I am of young children, I keep thinking, of course, of my youngest daughter who would like to become a doctor. And I think of the speed at which these things are happening. It takes just a few months for Elon Musk to put online a hyperscaler AI compute infrastructure. And yet it takes decades to train a doctor from scratch, from the moment the person decides that this would be his or her future. This may actually be dismaying to many, but at the same time, we have to think that the technologies that we're building now, which allow us to translate languages in real time, that allow us to access information and knowledge that could be very complex at any kind of level and language that we choose, is going to unlock new possibilities for people to be able to, say, become a doctor for people who don't speak your language, to actually find solutions locally to perhaps trivial medical conditions, thanks to the help of an AI doctor. Now, if we think in terms of the scale at which we can achieve such results, it will really depend on us training for the future, because much of what we can think of is happening today. AI advancing very fast, and some countries doing nothing at all. I think we have to start helping create hope for the next generations. And this is the message that Universal AI has in its mission. Hope in saying that people who were up to now excluded from getting healthcare can now get healthcare by 2040. That people who were not able to service populations in other languages can now be plurilingual in the services that they can provide. But these things are just minute examples of what we're hoping to achieving with AI in education. It's interesting to think that by 2040, these new generations are going to negotiate with nations on these very big intelligence machines. And at the same time, they probably are going to negotiate with agents with intelligence that are non-human. How we prepare our minds for that future? We should preserve our values, and we should keep in line with what education is meant to serve. It's meant to serve you a lifetime, not a 2-year upskilling on, say, a commercial product with AI. Education is at the frontier. It is what helps us outlast any technological change. And I hope that you're with me that we must be sovereign in our desire to help humanity and break all borders to be able to achieve that for the greatest number of people to benefit. Thank you. John, I'd like to invite you to come on board, please.
You need to unmute him, guys.
There you go.
Unmute.
There you go.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for having me. Yeah, so I'm tasked with talking about society. So a nice small topic. Look, I think one of the things that we have to face is that as much as we'd like to know what the future holds for us, it's very difficult to tell. It's very easy to kind of rewind the clock and go and see what people thought 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and see how many surprises got thrown at us. So, you might say, well, okay, I don't have an opinion. How can I be helpful here? I would say just kind of flagging the fact that there's just a tremendous amount of uncertainty. Let me propose that there's an area of uncertainty that probably maybe even gets less of a discussion than the one we all seem to focus on, which is the economic impacts. So I'm an economist by training. I definitely have tried to think a lot about what technology does to economies and marketplaces. It's very possible that some of the largest effects of this technology are more on social factors, about how people relate to each other, how people have a discourse, and how they make decisions. I mean, you can already start to see some inklings of this with some startups that are doing things like making AI friends and characters, and people kind of forming these parasocial relationships with AI. And we have no idea what that means. I think most of us probably have this initial reaction that this isn't a good thing. But we don't know what course that takes and what it does to people. Or you can already see on social media people taking and tagging Grok and saying, "Grok, is this true?" and like deferring kind of judgment about what's true in the world to a model with an uncertain maybe connection to reality, and who is it trained. We talked a little bit about sovereignty. If that does become something where people kind of look to models for guidance on what's true and false, that's something very different in the world, but also like very potentially very powerful. But you could also imagine a model beats a model, and so we maybe have this kind of meta discourse of models kind of trying to adjudicate disputes, which will be weird. In the future, I think will be weird in a lot of ways. Something that I'm particularly interested in, and have done quite a bit of kind of research on, is to what extent can we use these sort of models to understand the social world a bit better. So any person who tries to do some social science, you quickly run into the fact that humans are very complicated. It's very hard to write a model that really captures human behavior, and there's all these kind of idiosyncratic factors. And one thing that these models are kind of uniquely good at is imitating us. They've been trained on basically everything we've ever read, and probably increasingly everything we've ever said that shows up in these massive training corpus. And it ends up creating these models that can imitate us and react to things in ways similar to how we would. And there's now kind of this growing literature showing how well this can work, because particularly when you can kind of calibrate it in real data. This is potentially very powerful, and you could imagine a world in which a lot of our academic research, policy planning, market research, corporate strategy, all kind of a big component of it is trying to model out the situation ahead of time with AI. But of course, humans kind of think through things, and you might imagine that this kind of has a counter reaction where it becomes very important to be unpredictable in certain situations, and so you're trying to not do what the AI would have predicted you would do. So you might say it's a very bright future for game theorists and sort of strategic thinking. So let me just close with, I think that the future is very difficult to predict. We have a technology that is kind of changing a lot of things all at once, and the full implications of that are not even a little bit clear. Some of the big reactions might be more social and political than even economic. And then the last thing is, this is potentially also a way to understand the same thing that's changing and is making it difficult for us to understand what might happen next. So that's a good stopping point for me.
Thank you so much, John. As you can tell, this is a very, very rich, I believe, set of dimensions that we are perhaps not speaking about enough. And having said that, I'd like to ask a question to each of you. If you feel strongly, not quite so strongly, or why not at all, that we may or not need institutional redesign in the face of the changes that we see coming.
I can start if that's okay.
Please.
I think that it will probably happen in kind of an organic way as people start to, within firms, probably the most likely place where you see this at first, where they realize that, hey, there's this new capability. Maybe you can now increase the span of control. It becomes easier to manage a large number of people, and so maybe we kind of lose a little bit of middle management, and you get flatter organizations. I'm just speculating. That being said, redesigning organizations and organizational processes and jobs takes a lot longer than it takes for Anthropic to release a new model. So I think you probably will not see that happen immediately. You'll probably see it happen in young startups who are kind of starting with a blank slate and have the ability to kind of reconfigure things. And you do hear remarkable stories about startups, saying that they're able to do, move tremendously faster and write a lot more code with fewer people and different kind of designs. But it's probably too early to know with much certainty there.
Yeah, I can jump in on that, Andrei. I mean,
Abhi, yes.
If you look at how the advantages of adopting AI in a company, I mean, I honestly cannot visualize a company that competes today not using that advantage. Let's just build on what John talked about with, what I'll call AI-based synthetic research. All right. If you look at the historic product development cycles, okay, it takes, somewhere between 4 to 6 weeks to kind of find the population that responds to your target audience, get them online, go through the research process and get your institutions. If I can find some general market research and, augment that with a synthetic panel, okay, and I can get my answers in a day, how is a company that's going to compete with me ever keep up? It's just not going to happen. So you actually, for corporations, they have to adapt. It's adapt or die from my perspective. It's as simple as that. You cannot be running today a company on paper and pen when you're competing with people with computers. It's the equivalent of going into battle against battle tanks with arrows. Okay, it's just not going to work. Now, the bigger question in my mind is, how does this work in, what I'll call more governmental institutions? Because you essentially have a governance process that changes very, very slowly, and you have exponential technology learning on what I call a linear governance change. Plus, if you start off with what John talked about earlier, people are deferring decisions to AI, okay, and younger generations in particular. So if those decisions are made by an opaque algorithm, where's the accountability, right? On one hand, I'm going to tell you that this is a blessing, which is amazing, because in poor countries, I look at education, for example. I sit on the board of an education company. They've created a system that allows you to create a specific curriculum tailored to one of the thousands of school districts in the United States, takes and frees up 40% of teacher time. How could you not want that? On the other hand, do I want a machine making decisions for me that I cannot actually understand in a democratic sense? So it's really, I think institutions have to adapt and change, education, corporations, and especially government.
Yeah, can I just say that the education example is so good because it's a disaster for assessment, right? Because you have no ability to kind of say what was your work, but it's a golden age for kind of doing what was always hard about tutoring, like customized feedback and sort of adapting things to the kind of where a student is. I mean, it's the most remarkable, most patient tutor you could ever imagine. And so this one technology has kind of given us a problem and an amazing benefit at the same time.
Yeah, I think it is all exciting, and I think it's great to talk about the benefits and the potential it has, but we have to remember that behind all of this are human lives, and a lot of people are walking around and thinking, how is it going to affect me? Is my job on the line, right? So, Anderson said, oh, VCs is the only breed of people that will be needed in the future. Everybody will be extinct. And, we all think that, only me, I have this special judgment that I'll be required and everybody else, you can be replaced, right? So I think this is kind of a very delicate thing, and we need to have a broad perspective to really understand that, in young startups, people are driven by the mission of disrupting the big guys, and that's a very positive feeling. But in many places, people are walking around, maybe not at the top level, but thinking, what is going to happen to me? And I think we need to think about ways of getting this optimism to a bigger number of people. And I live in Europe, and the atmosphere here is different than it is in the US. And in Europe, we are not the ones who introduced, AI, right? We are not the ones who came with first models, with the foundational, we don't have that many chip production companies, few, 2 or 3. So we are in a different game, and we are trying to catch up. And when you're trying to catch up, you also have a different attitude. And I think we need to as leaders in the society, I think we need to recognize it and figure out how to make sure that there is a broad adoption. Because I think I completely agree, Abhi, if you don't jump on this train, you miss a civilizational opportunity, because things are moving fast, and we need to find the energy within each community, within ourselves, to change ourselves, to be able to live in the new world.
Absolutely. And I wanted to jump on that because, I was invited to give a talk on AI and development for the World Bank Group. And it was for a 2-day event with youth leaders in South America who, upon my surprise, when I asked, who here uses ChatGPT, I mean, all of them did. Who has heard of vibe coding? All of them did vibe coding, and none of them, were over 20. So the surprising fact to me was, to discuss with them that, in fact, none of the things that they know about AI or what they can do with AI, they've learned at school. Nor did they have an actual person tutoring them on how. In fact, I believe that a lot of the youth today, no matter what country, is for the first time fulfilling that immense curiosity that somehow our schooling may have killed in many of us adults. And I'm feeling that there's tremendous opportunity in paying attention to how to work with that youth, with that leadership that is emerging out of necessity, perhaps, but also out of this, immense curiosity about where AI can take us. How much can we grow personally, and how much can we build community, thanks to these tools. To wrap up, the interesting part with the conversation with an organization like the World Bank was to say, how much money is spent in consultants, who cost thousands per day to bring to remote places to talk to some people through someone who can interpret the realities they feel. Today, we have leaders who live that reality, who could speak with AI in their own native languages and can get infinite answers from, sufficiently sophisticated AI that no consultant would offer to them. Future's bright, I think. So with that, I would move to the next question, because it seems like we have an understanding, at least, that these trade-offs may not make sense when the goal is to advance human civilization at the frontier. In a way, we have these immediate urgencies that we are trying to address, and people want copilots and people want instant answers. At the same time, there's this long-term strategic goal for society. I mean, how do you see the trade-off, between the now and the present versus the long-term goal for humanity?
Well, the thing that I kind of think about, being on the investment side, I would like to have as many potential customers for the companies I invested in as possible. So the way to make sure that there are a lot of customers is to make sure that, there is prosperity reasonably equally spread, right? Because that's really what creates dynamism, that everybody feels, hey, I can do something, I can buy this, I can move the needle. So when people say, I see the world in 15 years where, we will have universal income and we don't have to work, I worry. Because that means for me, to me that, you don't have, the customers are gone, right? I mean, I want people to not have universal income, but more and more and more income every single year, and everybody to be fruitfully employed. And I just don't yet know what to do. And maybe, John, you have a perspective on this. Maybe you've done some, scenario planning. Like, what are the critical levers we have to play with? Because, Europe starts immediately with regulations, and that's probably not the wrong way, because sometimes we don't yet know what we are regulating and we're already thinking about regulating. But I think we need to see a way forward where, not 10 or 15% of the people will be working and the rest of us will have universal income. I think this, from investor perspective, I think is very important.
Yeah, I thank you. I have a few thoughts. I mean, so, one is if it is the case that this technology is sort of like remarkably labor saving, in the sense that you can, produce a heck of a lot more with far fewer people. That's also a world where people are, their real incomes have risen a lot because the price of things falls. An MRI in the United States might cost you $3,000. If that costs $15 instead, that frees you up to kind of purchase a lot of other things. And so there is kind of, what economists would call like a general equilibrium thing that you have to consider. And I'm generally pretty optimistic. I think humans are really number one at figuring out new things that they want and new things to spend money on. That being said, there is absolutely winners and losers, and people say who made human capital investments at one point and then, their human capital becomes worthless, but things also maybe move a bit slower than that. I think one of the things that's I think we kind of struggle with is that, look, all this capital getting poured into these companies, there's no kind of like, hey, is this good for society perspective? It's what, is this actually like a reasonable, an economic investment? Does this have some ROI? We kind of hope in many cases that those kind of investments lead to good things for us. But if we have collective goals that we want to accomplish, I don't think we can necessarily, just assume that, well, the path would go in the right direction for us. So, policy, regulation, how do you guide things like that? These can all make sense. That being said, I think you have to think about what levers do you actually have to pull. I was once at a panel where people were talking about AI and like how we should regulate this, and it was the time when DeepSeek dropped. And so you have maybe 15 people with something like $4 million in inference, dropped a state-of-the-art model on the world. That's a world that's like very hard. People have a lot of agency. And so thinking that you can kind of guide things in your preferred direction, not to be fatalistic, but I think we have to have a kind of be a little humble about what levers do we actually have to pull in a world where lots of people can do lots of things without our say-so.
Yeah, I mean, just building on what Bogy threw out, right? I think you have to be careful about the rush to regulate before you know what you're regulating. And I think you have a better chance to think about managing outcomes than specific elements of regulation, because you don't know how you will get there. And the DeepSeek is a great example that John just brought up. The assumption was nobody could do anything unless you had this ridiculously large infrastructure. And behold, on our platform, I'll tell you openly that DeepSeek is the most popular model. All right. And this is an open source, open weights model that is hosted on American servers, running on American chips, on American soil. And soon, as I was mentioning to Bogy and John and Andrei before, it'll be running in the UK, Germany, and Australia. Okay. But this is not a Chinese model. I look at the open weights, open source models as a gift to humanity, frankly, okay, on that particular area. I'm also deeply optimistic about what this can do from a reskilling education perspective. As John said, not only is the world's most patient tutor, it's actually the most personalized tutor you could ever have. And it frees up the human teachers to be mentors, guides, champions for you. And if you think about your life yourself, all of you, there has to be in your past a teacher, a professor who took an interest in you and took you under the wing. I know for me, it was that way, and I'll always be deeply grateful for the path they led me on. So the question really comes down to, yes, you need to have regulation, but I would say be thoughtful about how you regulate because you want to regulate the outcomes. The talk about, overinvestment has happened multiple times in history. This is not new. One example that I lived through, because I used to be, prior to being in the applications, the SaaS business and AI business, I was in telecoms. Okay. Look at the fiber bust that happened. Yes, the first set of people who invest in that all lost their money. But let me tell you something. All of that fiber now has been used and more, and you have a fresh burst of fiber investing that's happening in the United States. And that is true the world over. So the capacity that's being built out here, I think, will eventually be used for the right purposes. The elements of societal inequality, I think that goes beyond AI is just another accelerant on top of what's happening. The larger issue is capital substituting labor and therefore imbalance accruing to the holders of capital. That to me is something that regulation might want to think about in terms of how you tax, for example.
Very interesting. I mean, it makes me in the back of my mind thinking that regulation doesn't necessarily have to be restrictive, right? I think it could also be empowering, as in promoting more of what we know would be good to help advance. Like the young people who actually can build the DeepSeeks of the world, with smaller machinery, and perhaps collectively achieve far more than any one company with just a dozen specialists. So in that sense, I mean, it reminded me of a conversation that Eric Schmidt brought to the Paris summit just, a few months ago, where he said one of the biggest threats he saw was this open source, AI models. And in a way, it is because of, like Abhi said, it can populate the entire world who cannot afford to pay a $200 a month for an AI that they don't even know what it could be used for, versus actually having AI that is custom for purpose, that can solve problems on the field at the scale of 10 billion people. So I wonder if you see a frontier there, which is probably one of the frontiers we have not seen, or you see other frontiers that, this perhaps competition is surfacing so that there's more opportunity that we have to pay attention to.
I think open source software and open models and open weight models are fantastic and the future, and I think like worthy of subsidization. I think you get sometimes people kind of saying negative things about open models will frame it in sort of like a security framing, but I think if you kind of dig a little deeper, there's people who have a vested interest in closed source models, and even regulation. The bigger labs, there's kind of a point where maybe it makes it's attractive for there to be lots of regulation because that makes it harder for a new startup to join. And even if you say, well, we'll put some cap on training runs or something, and you say, well, look, that only would affect these big guys, but Bogy could tell you like investors are investing because they want it to become a big guy eventually. And if that cap is sort of hanging over their head, and I think what's difficult is that trying to regulate at that level of like we're gonna regulate certain like technical features of how things work. I mean that's a recipe for bad regulation because the field moves too quickly and regulators aren't going to have the expertise to understand like, well, what is the precise thing we could do that won't hamper innovation but will actually have protection. I'm very what Abhi kind of mentioned, like let's have policy about outputs. And use levers that we already sort of know how they work, like taxation and capital controls and things like that that may have more less kind of like downstream effects or choke off innovation.
But I think we have to also notice that regulation or the legal infrastructure built for a new technology that is coming forward can be a huge competitive advantage for a country. I'm thinking of Switzerland. Switzerland adopted a very stable, well thought through set of laws for Bitcoin, for cyber world, for digital world. And because of that, it created the whole ecosystem of lawyers, the whole infrastructure, the human infrastructure and the legal infrastructure was so strong that anybody that was doing anything in Bitcoin, when many countries outlawed it, US being the first one, right? Like, people were banned doing certain things in the US. So people went to Switzerland and it attracted, so it basically created a huge community of companies that put their domiciliation there. I'm thinking of Estonia, who created e-residency. And right now it's in Europe. It's a country that it's so easy to establish a company and liquidate a company. In many places you can easily establish a company, but liquidation is a different thing. So regulation can have a huge competitive advantage. I'm not sure with AI, but I would be surprised if Switzerland was not moving fast on this front again, because it's not a very costly thing. Yet the benefit of attracting a lot of capital because something works in your country, it's a huge benefit with very little investment.
I think that's an excellent analogy that Bogy just went through. I don't see why Switzerland couldn't replicate something of this sort in this area, right? They gave, as she said, very clear regulatory clarity, right? You had public-private collaboration. You had compliance regulations that were enforced from a KYC perspective, know your customer perspective. I don't see why you couldn't take a similar approach in the AI space for somebody like a Switzerland, or frankly for Europe. But I think if you step back, that's a different type of regulation than the kind of regulation that you see sort of instinctive, knee-jerk reactions to. And if you step back and think about what goes in, what fundamentally you require out here in AI is talent. And Switzerland and Europe are attractive places for people to be. Certain nations, including my own, recently have, been a little wary about who they're letting in. China is a fairly homogenous market. I mean, this is where Europe can actually start attracting talent because the basis for AI innovation is going to be talent. You have incredible educational systems. You have incredible social welfare states. Use that to attract the kind of talent you have and then worry about regulating the outcomes. But let's have something that you can regulate first. And, I like what John said, democratize access. Why not making, if you are going to have social services and universal education, it's an access at a base level to some sort of AI for education in an open source model, not something that should be offered to your citizens. Maybe you should think about that, right? I think those are places for us to start off rather than kind of knee-jerk try to regulate something that you just don't actually know how it's going to play out. I am in this industry. I live in the heart of the valley. My company is headquartered in Palo Alto. And I'll tell you that every week I wake up surprised by something that happened.
100%. Yeah, and I think also just that the talent point. We were kind of talking earlier about how much of this work is being done in the United States and China, but at least in the U.S., a big chunk of that work is done by Europeans living in the United States, right? These companies are filled with people who got their degrees in Europe, or entrepreneurs that are attracted to what you can kind of pull off in San Francisco that's hard to pull off in other parts of the world. And I think there's probably a lesson there, like why does it have to be that way? What is the root cause that kind of draws talent that you know, could be definitely the homegrown creators of these companies. And it's not, you know, it's not like there's not, you know, this whole stack kind of depends on a Dutch company, you know, if you kind of peel back enough. And so it's not a lack of talent, it's probably something else.
Well, it's the scale, right? The US has a huge scale, and Europe is really still a lot of different countries, a lot of different jurisdictions. We're introducing the regime of 28th legal regime, which basically for startups, you can work all within Europe under the same rules. It has not been yet adopted, but I think it's a very good cause. You know, I kind of work between the two continents, so I see why people want to go to the US, the young founders. But most of the really successful companies, they have a European founder at the helm, or Indian, or, you know, Asian, right? So the talent is not the issue. I think it's the culture. It's the culture and the opportunity that you can have. Yeah.
I'd like to add to that, because it's interesting that we are now saying, you know, we have the right conditions somewhere to perhaps educate very high caliber talent that can then go and work in the US. At the same time, you know, we know for a fact that one of the great disciplines that has made Switzerland known on the map is its diplomatic, you know, being the diplomatic center of the world. As in, it's the platform for which or where everyone from any nation can come and discuss, you know, whether it's protocols for the internet, whether it's humanitarian aid, whether it is, I would argue now, the future of intelligence. You know, one of the things that I heard in another panel was this idea of intelligence embassies, and saying, you know, why do we need to, you know, restrict ourselves to jurisdiction, you know, because you're on a given land, when the actual land we're talking about in the new world is, you know, compute. So this compute, we might assign it its own, you know, set of diplomatic advantages, just like we do for embassies. For that same virtue, you know, those who work on top, as in, like, you know, consulates and other members of the diplomatic body, should be able to also, you know, act on that platform like agents that are in a different jurisdiction for the sake of, you know, very valuable high purpose goals. What do you guys think about that?
I think the idea is good. You know, it gives you a sense that you can really achieve a lot more, you know, within the same platform. So you know, I want to just be aware that there was a question asked here. Maybe we can also address it. Andrei, what do you think? Because it's related a little bit with what
it is related, yeah.
Go ahead. Read it up so we can build on top as you
could
see it.
free AI models be the top of the iceberg for bigger societal changes in sovereign countries, eventually putting them to race towards transparent governments, open source code when it comes to voting, and decentralizing decisions to citizens? Or has this race silently started?
And your thoughts on that?
Well, Switzerland is a good place because we have direct democracy. We actually vote on a lot of things, right? And actually, right now, e-voting is in place already. So, you know, it has started. I'm not aware of other countries that are thinking of changing their constitution to become direct democracies, because it was just too complicated to do that. But maybe the US could be the next example as a counterbalance to the current modus operandi.
I'm not a political scientist, but I think the literature on, like, ballot propositions in the US is somewhat negative, in the sense that it's often sort of powerful interests sort of shape the questions that get presented and present them in a way where, like, the full implications of them are not clear. So I'm a little bit down on direct democracy. I'm more of a Republican, and not in the US sense, but, like, I think filtering it through representation is useful. But I think a more positive view here, like there is lots of potential kind of like ways we could redesign all sorts of organizations. So one of my colleagues at Sloan has done some work on like using AI to help people deliberate and reach consensus on issues. And so that's kind of small p politics, maybe, within, even within a firm or a neighborhood. There's maybe like different ways of doing things that are now possible. So, there's just like, I think a lot of room for exploration of alternative ways of doing things.
Yeah, I'll quickly comment that the models themselves can be open source, but it's not free because you still need infrastructure to run those models. I just want to make sure I clarify that to the team out here, right? You can make it free by putting that on top of open source public infrastructure. So if the European Union, for example, collaborated to say, I have to have a certain access, certain amount of free, let's say, open source model access, okay, for models that have been stripped, let's say, of political ideology. You can take an open source, open weights model, retrain it and fine tune it, right, to take away some of the bias, for example, from a Chinese open source model, right? But those models are amazing. And from my perspective, come back to what John said earlier. Open models in many ways are challenging the dominance of centralized corporate controlled AI. That's what is a vested interest in trying to cast aspersions on them. By the way, the same thing happened if you go back and take a look at Linux, for example, right? By the way, I'll just point out Linux came from a Finnish citizen. Okay, he's Linus is the one who really kind of pushed that process forward. I personally see Europe actually really should be able to capitalize on what has happened with open source and take it into this various domains of interest that Europe is so strong at. And if you can find a way to subsidize or some level of ability to kind of democratize access to this to European entrepreneurs, actually the capital investments required to start up those companies today could actually be reduced if you're focusing on the right type of applications. If you're going into the foundational areas and competing head on with the US and China, I think I put down some statistics that said it's not the smart thing for you to do. But I think there is a way forward and it aligns beautifully with sovereignty, accountability, and public interest, in my opinion.
Excellent. So we're pretty much reaching the hour, and I wanted to invite you to think of the question that we have not addressed that we should be thinking about that is so profound that we need another panel to think through. To me, this has been an amazing exercise to get us already out of the box of the full-fledged, trillion-dollar compute infrastructure building onto bringing us to the possibility of collaboration, of potentially new forms of regulation where diplomacy may play a role, where advantages of one place may actually be good complements to advantages in another place for one and the same solution. With that, I'd love to hear, what questions do you have? In one line, you don't need to address it.
You mean to all of us or to the audience?
To the audience, to everyone.
Right.
They may be muted, Andrei, so they might need to type it in.
Oh, I'm asking you to wrap it up with a question you have to leave open that, all this conversation has led you to think it's important to consider.
So when I think about all the time is this technology in aggregate a complement or a substitute for expertise?
Abhi?
I think how I can grow and use this new technology for the later stages of my life. Being older, I think how can it prepare me to be stronger and more independent as long as possible. So yeah.
My advice to people and question to people is, why not embrace what you see in front of you and see where it takes you? I think you should not fear it. You should embrace it, and you can shape it. So why not try to do that instead of hanging back?
And I would like to say thank you to all of you for contributing to this conversation. These frontiers we've explored, I hope we've seen, are not necessarily barriers, but certainly very important dimensions that we need to pay attention to. I think it invites collaboration at scales we have never attempted before, with granularity and intent that we have never perhaps yet done. So with that, I'd like to hope that we meet again. And to the audience, let's meet at the frontier. Let's build more together.
Thank you so much.
Everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrei and the panel. Just very, very insightful and substantial conversation, and have a great evening. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Bogy. Thank you, Abhi. Thank you, the audience.